thanks to all of you for being here today. This is actually our second session of the day. We had 6 candidates in this morning. It was a good conversation, went for an hour and a half. We'll do the same now. A couple of things I just want to explain to you. One is I wanted to say thanks for being patient with us. A few of the campaigns have called us in the last few weeks, said, you know, when are you guys doing your thing? And we kept putting you off. And we did it for 2 reasons. One is we're hoping some of you would drop out. And
I've been trying to get them.
Thank you.
you know, I'm not saying who, but we thought, you know, a smaller group would be easier to interview. And secondly, we thought maybe if we did a poll, that would show you really where the action is, the front runners, and who you really needed to talk to. And we came to the conclusion after doing a poll that that's not a good idea. That first of all, the numbers didn't show such a clear 2 or 3 front runners that we thought we could do that. And secondly, a lot of really good people would not have been invited. So we decided now, late in the game, to have these 2 sessions today. So thanks for doing that. And the second thing I wanted to point out is why this grouping as opposed to the morning grouping. And Marilyn and I sat down in my office about a week ago and we pulled names out of a hat. And that's how we pulled this off. So blame fate if you have problems with that. So with that, we'll just get right to it. We're not going to do opening remarks, stump speeches. You guys have all done that enough. And I'll just turn it to Marilyn.
Thank you. This is a question about revenue, and we'll start with County Board President Toni Preckwinkle. Given the soda tax and the way you restored the sales tax that you had previously cut, the concern among some voters is that you are more likely than others to raise taxes. Is that unfair? How do you see it?
You know, we clearly face some fiscal challenges in the city of Chicago, and we have to look at them through an equity lens. You know, I've always spoken for the need of a progressive income tax in the state of Illinois. That's the fairest way to raise revenue, and it's an option that's available to the state and not at local units of government. A progressive income tax not only gives the state additional revenue, but it also provides revenue for local units of government through the local government distributive fund. So that's the first thing that I always talk about. And secondly, you know, this is going to be a situation where there's shared sacrifice. I've talked about tax increment financing districts and the ways in which we have abused that economic development tool. 31% of our property tax revenues now goes into these sequestered TIF districts. That's not sustainable over the long term. We also need to look at workman's comp, where the county has 22,000 employees and spends $20 million on workman's comp. The city has 10,000 more employees and spends $100 million on workman's comp. When I came into office in 2010, we had a $487 million gap to close in our budget. And I brought the 11 separately elected officials in and said, this is going to be shared sacrifice. And we made 15% cuts in the budgets of all of our separately elected officials. We refinanced some of our debts. We looked at a variety of options. There are no silver bullets. There's no magic to this. As I said, it's going to be shared sacrifice. We're going to have to look at a lot of different options. We face some real challenges, but those are challenges that I've addressed as president of the county. In the last 8 years, I've closed budget gaps of $2.1 billion. We made $850 million in cuts. We reduced our workforce by 13% and our indebtedness by 11%. So I've taken on tough challenges before and addressed them.
So what did you learn out of the way the soda tax kind of backfired? What did you learn from that?
Well, you know, we needed revenue, and it's clear that this was not popular, and this is a representative government, and so it was repealed. And we made the very difficult decisions that we had to make. We eliminated 1,000 positions in the county, 1,000 positions, balanced our budget, and moved forward.
I want to ask a follow-up on the state income tax. Who's to say that the state is going to give us, you know, they face fiscal problems themselves, and then if we could hear from the others on their ideas as well.
Yeah,
Let me just say that
somebody else about how can you be confident the state will come over with a progressive income tax? Tony, Gery?
Yes. Look, I'm for a progressive income tax. We just need to know what the schedules are. I don't want to hurt working families any more than we already hurt. And to President Preckwinkle's comment, anybody who assumes the office of mayor is going to have to take on very, very difficult circumstances. So the issue that I worry about the longest is the impulse to just tax and tax and tax and tax more. think people are up to hear, Tom, in my conversations with them around the city. We have to be very, very careful in how we raise revenue, which is why I spent a lot of time thinking about how we could raise revenue without putting it on the backs of our citizens. I've talked about these downtown skyscrapers.
Why do you mention Toni Preckwinkle specifically? Are you
Because
critical of her for raising the sales
well,
tax?
look, I've not been shy about this. I think that it's important that we not have anybody in there who's going to have the impulse to hit us on a soda tax again. And it's not just soda. Look, it's not just soda. It's Gatorade, it's Frappuccino.
Soda tax, clearly.
Well, you know, I don't know. Gatorade, Frappuccino, coffee drinks, all of these things were taxed. That's why there was the massive backlash that you saw.
We have to let Toni respond. You said she has an impulse to tax.
No, you know, the way in which we addressed our $487 million gap when I walked in the door was the first thing we did was reduce our expenses. As I said, 15% cuts in the budget of every separately elected official, 15% cuts. And we refinanced some of our debt. Those were the ways in which we made up most of the $487 million gap. And as I said, over the last 8 years, $2.1 billion in budget gaps closed, $850 million in cuts, 13% cut in our workforce, and 11% cut in our indebtedness. I think that's a record that can't be matched in the city or the state.
Let's go to Paul. He's been.
I want to speak to this issue of the progressive income tax. And incidentally, if anybody thinks that, by taxing downtown skyscrapers, you're suddenly going to solve the pension problem, it's another easy thing. It's an easy, it's a diversion. It's a shiny object. At the end of the day, if you're going to address the pension funding issue, you're going to need a serious state agenda, and you're going to need a serious budget cutting agenda. And, when I took over the Chicago Public Schools and the BGA did one of their patented facts checks. And when we closed a $1.4 billion structural deficit over 4 years, we did it in many ways the way Toni did it. We went in and we eliminated unnecessary spending. We reduced contractual obligations, et cetera. But let me speak to the progressive income tax. You can make the income tax progressive without going to a constitutional amendment by simply using tax credits and tax exemptions. So because the Constitution requires that the tax be uniform. So if you have tax credits that are uniform and you cap those tax credits, you can literally take almost half, if not more, of the voters out of the increases, and you can provide lower income voters with significant tax relief. That's number one. Number two, because Toni spoke to the issue of fair share, there are two funds that funnel money to local governments. Now, we have a Democratic veto-proof majority in the House and Senate, and Susana will tell you this, we've got a Democratic governor, right? Well, we should expect that they're going to stop diverting $300 million in local and corporate personal property tax revenues away from local governments. That's counties and municipalities and schools. And we should have at least expect that if they're going to raise the income tax, that they not play with the local government distributive fund. The local government distributive fund says that local governments get a share of the income tax increases. And what happened the last two times is nobody went down to Springfield and lobbied to make sure that the legislature at the last minute didn't jingle with that fund or play with that fund to keep local governments from getting money. So if you did those two things for Chicago, it would generate between $275 and $300 million in additional revenues, which would address almost 1/3 of your long-term pension obligation.
But the reality is, the progressive income tax, whether it comes online or doesn't come online, it's not going to happen soon enough to address the immediate needs in Chicago. We have to, and also the thing that nobody's talked about yet is we can't go back to the taxpayers on top of the largest property tax increase, the regressive fines, taxes, and fees that we've imposed on people, and say, by the way, before we've done anything else, we want the extra change in your pocket. We can't do that. We have to build a case for revenue. Revenue is obviously going to be something on the table, but we've got to deal with the inefficiencies that are already existing in government. If we, for example, tackled the out of control settlements, judgments, and attorneys' fees that we're spending to the tune of $50 to $60 million every year, $500 million over the last 7 years regarding police misconduct, that would yield a substantial amount of income. If we dealt with the fact that every single year we have an enormous overrun in police overtime, in part because, frankly, ROM started too late to rebuild the depleted resources in the police department.
You started your comment by saying, though, that progressive income tax is great. I think everybody here probably supports it, but won't come online soon enough. You have to do
That's right.
something sooner.
And neither will the
But the
casino,
example of
neither will the
using-
legalization of
The
marijuana.
example of using reduction in police settlements against the police department, that's not going to happen
Right.
anytime soon either. There are
Well,
cases in the pipeline.
I disagree with that, actually.
Really?
I think there are things that are in place that frankly, if the city and the police department are true to the consent decree, we can start to see some of those changes this year. And frankly, there's no reason to wait. I've been talking for the last 2 years about the lack of urgency with the mayor and the corporation council to get a hold on these out of control expenses that are draining resources and frankly delegitimizing the police department. So there's no reason for us to wait. We could start doing something about this right now today.
We make changes, but they will not show up. They will not show up immediately because these cases takes years to work their way through the courts. We just had a settlement for the Englewood 4, which was $24 million.
Right.
And that was several years ago.
Yeah, but that's
we
because
want to give
frankly you had
someone else
somebody
a chance
in
to
charge.
chime
of
in
it.
on this, so
good
we want to
idea.
start on
You know,
this end.
I
Mr.
do
Fioretti.
believe the problem that we're faced with, whoever gets sworn in by May 15th, by September 1st, has to find $300 million. $400 million. $400 million is what we're faced with. I know the Tribune throws around a figure of 200 and the numbers have shifted a couple of times. How do we find $400 million for the pension fund for this year and 600 after that and 800 and then $1 billion?
Right.
And so we have $2 billion in 4 years that we're paying into our pension fund. 6 years ago, I did propose the commuter tax, 1% on all the people that come into this city from suburbs, from Indiana, Wisconsin, would generate $300 million. It's a question of equity. It's a question of fairness. It doesn't chase people out. It in fact stabilizes our own economy here. And it creates a system that those that come into this city contribute. They want safe streets. They want good neighborhoods. They want an ambulance. If they're having a heart attack before they hit the ground, they want that ambulance there. We need to look at what we can do. And that's $300 million. Video poker, we can raise it. And I know your paper said something about, well, it's subject to this. Well, there are startup costs, but it would probably, the people I've talked to would generate about $75 million in the first year. So we, lift the ban, highly regulate it, and see what we can do. If we can't find $25 million more out of the first year, and Paul is right, we need a legislative agenda in Springfield, and we need one in DC to help us solve this problem.
So
Mr.
I would
Ford
thank you,
chime
Mary
in.
Mitchell, and thank the entire, I would think that what we hear from all of the candidates here is more the same. I mean, the problem that we have to deal with the machine politics that has destroyed communities and families for many years. We have to deal with the racism and discrimination in this city that's costing taxpayers and the city too much money. Here we are, Black History Month, and 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, Chicago is still the most segregated city in the country, and that's too bad. These things really drags the Chicago economy down. I've heard what Lori said. She's absolutely right to a certain degree. We have to stop wasting our taxpayer dollars. So we could continue to try to raise money, but we're only going to raise money to pay for corruption in this city. That's why I'm running for mayor, because we're going to destroy those machine politics in this city.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the word corruption, because that's a segue into where our
Mary,
next
I
question.
really would love to.
You're going to get the question.
Great, thank
You're going to get the question. So if you want to chime in on the last
I wanna
question,
deal with
and
the
you get the
economics.
first question.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I
Mhm.
appreciate that. When it comes to the issue of the looming pension payment, which is really the most critical thing that we're going to jump into right after being sworn in. Unless if somebody knows where there's $400 million laying under a rock somewhere, we have to deal with the pressing question of cash now. I have been the controller for the state of Illinois and championed a bonding deal that saved taxpayers between $4 and $6 billion. And while the particulars of that are different than the scenario that we're looking at with the city, it's still important to not throw the bonding deal out as a potential financial tool that we should be looking at, because it's the quickest way to have immediate cash flow to make that payment.
You're
I
talking
think
about the pension obligation
Yes,
bond?
yes, exactly. I think we need to be honest though with the public and transparent as to how that would work. I don't believe that a $10 billion bond deal with zero transparency is the way to go. But I think that one of the things that I've proven as controller is that I believe in full transparency when it comes to the finances and laying out the groundwork for the public as to, is it a $2 billion? Is it a $5 billion? Is it a $7 billion? What the risk and what the return would be, because we do need immediate cash, and a casino isn't going to happen fast. Marijuana isn't going to happen fast. Neither is, of course, a progressive income tax, all of which I support. But nonetheless, those are long-term options versus a short-term need for cash.
But the problem is that the very idea of the pension obligation bond, as you said, hasn't been transparent.
Right.
There
That's
hasn't been
I totally agree with you.
there hasn't
We're on
been
the same
sufficient
page. So that's
information.
exactly what I'm saying.
That
That
doesn't
the
make
one,
sense,
the,
does
the reason why,
And it's been a
hold on.
disaster in
But
Detroit
the
and
reason
Stockton
why,
and the state of
but it
Illinois.
hasn't been, for example,
not
with what
in
we've
Wisconsin.
done at the state level. Can I?
Ms. Mendoza.
Yes. Would love to answer this
here's-
because I
here's
feel
where
like this
we're
is my
trying to
sweet
go
spot.
here on this question.
Totally.
After everything that you said,
Yes.
whether you're talking about taxes or bonds or any of that, it all boils down to whether the taxpayer believes that their money is being used properly.
Exactly,
And
which
that-
is why
that-
I have
that's not
ushered
into a
in
system of corruption.
No,
So
totally,
my
but-
next question, which you can
I
answer
can answer
first.
that. I'll finish answering that.
Yes,
part. Yes,
the
thank
next
you.
question